Hi guys, and welcome to a little tutorial I want to present to you regarding alphas for detailing. ZBrush has become increasingly popular these days for hard surface modelling, and there are quite a few hard details that would be really difficult to do using standard sculpting techniques if it were not for alphas. So you can see I've already applied several alphas to this model. I want to explore using alphas for detailing. Now you're probably familiar already with the basics of using alphas. You select a brush, you select a drag rectangle stroke, select your alpha. In this case we'll use this arrows one. And you can drag it onto the mesh, scaling and rotating as we drag the mouse, or pen in this case. Now you'll notice it has very soft fade at the edges. Now this is because of the default focal shift on the brush. So we'll adjust the focal shift to -100 and let's undo the previous alpha. Now if we draw out, we get a very crisp version of the alpha, and we can increase the Z intensity, and this will give us a much more pronounced detail. There we go. Now if we press Alt when we do this, we will get an inward depression instead, so this will push the alpha inwards. Okay, so this is all great, but it's fairly standard. Now this tutorial is aimed at people who know these basics already. I want to look at using alphas in a non-standard way, in particular using non-uniform scaling. So that is to deform the original aspect ratio of any given alpha. So by default we can scale and rotate when we drag, but we're forced to keep the aspect ratio that the alpha was created in. What I want to do is to stretch the alpha without having to drop it into Photoshop to rescale it. So I want to be able to stretch it at will directly in ZBrush. So on this layer here that I've just turned on, you can see a few examples of the alpha of the arrows, and you can see that they've been non-uniformly stretched. Now I'm going to show you the most simple, reliable and effective way of doing this. But first it's important that the alphas we use are good quality. So we need to look at alpha creation and ensuring we have the best possible starting point. Now sometimes when we create an alpha from geometry in ZBrush, there are some problems, and these will hinder us getting good results. So we need to know how to fix this. So I'm going to switch tools to the one I'm going to use to create our alpha. I'm just going to create a little panel detail here. So I'm going to grab this and create an alpha from it. So the first thing to do is to snap this to the front view with the perspective off, and then going to the alpha menu, I'm going to select from mesh. We will then zoom in. Now there's a tendency to zoom in too far and fill the entire alpha with the detail so you get maximum resolution. However, we need to allow some buffer zone for radial fade. Now this is because there's very often issues with the edges of alphas not blending correctly. So ensure you leave some space around the main details. If you're not familiar with radial fade and what it does, don't worry, and we'll discuss that shortly. So I click OK, and you'll see it's created my alpha. Now if I start dragging with this straight away, you'll notice as I rotate my model, it drops division levels to keep performance. Now my machine is fast, so I don't need that. So I'm going to go to Preferences and increase the Q-trans threshold, in this case to 2.5. Now that's millions of polys before it will reduce subdivisions. So that's fixed my visual glitch. It only affects meshes with multiple subdivision levels. So it's happy now, and you can see where it's white it will cause high points and black will be unaffected. And you can see that's exactly the case where this is drawn out. So the first modification we're going to make is to invert the alpha. Now this will put black on the outside, theoretically leaving the outside of the stroked area completely unaffected. You'll see though, when I draw this out, there is a slight error. There's a small lip around the alpha. So if we switch to the previous alpha, which was the multiple arrows, here we go, and if we drag this one out, you'll see there is no error. Now that's the problem I mentioned that does happen sometimes when you create alphas from 3D geometry. Now this generally doesn't happen if you draw them by hand in Photoshop, and that's how these arrows would have been created. But the 3D created one has this lip, so why? What's going wrong? Well, it's the fact that the area that should be black is actually very dark grey, so it pushes the geo out very, very slightly. So we need to fix this. If we don't, the method we want to use to sculpt the non-uniform versions will have errors. So the usual way to sort this is people tend to reach for the radial fade and mid value. Now first off, mid value is where we'll start. So this is slightly technical, but it tells ZBrush which shade of grey in the alpha should be used for the 50% depth mark. All you really need to know is that tweaking this value affects the depth of the alpha and the depth it's sculpted at. So currently you can see it's slightly raised up, but if I increase the mid value, it'll push the alpha deeper into the mesh. Perfect. We only want to push it down gently, so let's try a value of 3. Now that's a lot better and it will do as a starting point, but it's not perfect. So let's try the radial fade to try and blend the edge. So let's first of all increase it quite a bit. Now that fixes the issue, but it's softened the alpha detail itself. If I crank the value right up, you'll see how bad this can be. So you can see it's really, really soft now. So we need to keep this value as low as possible. So let's try a value of 7. Now that looks okay-ish, and there's a little bit of detail softening, but that's okay. And the original was concave detail, so we'll undo that and we'll draw it out whilst pressing the Alt key, and that gives us the concave mesh. So there we go, that looks okay, it's not terrible. So our alpha is now fixed, right? Possibly. So let's start looking at the scaling solution I promised. In recap, the brush method allows us to position, rotate and scale, but it doesn't allow non-uniform scaling. If I wanted to change the aspect ratio, I would have to export the alpha to an image editor, rescale, re-import, and hope I had guessed the scaling correctly. So to do all this in ZBrush, we're going to use masks. So let's change our mask type to mask rectangle. When we make a mask with a rectangle, we can mask in any proportions we want. We have full flexibility. So if I apply an alpha to my mask rectangle, let's select our alpha. We can now drag that alpha out in any proportion. Pressing the spacebar allows us to move the mask around, and this gives us much better precision for positioning. I'll press Alt to invert, and now we have our mask applied. Brilliant! Let's return to our original brush and select No Alpha. Next, drag out a rectangle in the unmasked area, and there we have the extrusion we want. But it has that original lip error again. But didn't we fix all that? Well, if we look in the mask alpha settings by pressing Ctrl, you'll see the mid value and radial fade are back at their defaults of 0. In the brush, it's 3 and 7, but in the mask, it's 0. Okay, let's set the mask settings back to the values we know look good. So now it will be fixed, right? Let's try again. It doesn't look great. I can see the mask is still slightly lighter than the surrounding masked area. Just the same, not fixed. For some reason, the radial fade and mid value don't work in the mask mode. So we need to fix the alpha itself. So let's select the alpha in the standard brush again. With those settings it looks good, just as it did before. So let's reset those values to 0 and we'll see the lip is back. So we need to fix this. And we know the problem is that the black area is not quite pure black. We fix this with the alpha adjust gradient. If you understand how these gradients work, that's helpful, but not essential. You can simply follow along. It helps to understand, so down here in the bottom left is the blacks, top right is the whites. What it's showing is that what's black in the alpha will be translated into black when we use it. If I increase this here, what's black will be drawn out as about 30% grey. If I drag on the model, you can see this elevates the surrounding area. I want to do the opposite of this. I want to take the darkest area on our image, the not quite black, but force it to be drawn as black. So I click on the graph to create a point, and then drag off, then back on to make it a sharp corner. And I'll drag this to the bottom. Now this makes that point become black. So we'll really exaggerate this by dragging this point right over. Now all but the lightest shades will be converted to black. You can see this now only draws the very top of the alpha. I only want to take what's nearly black and force it to be pure black. So I'll take it right back almost to the left edge, but not quite. Now when I draw it out, it's fixed. No mid-value or radial tweaks needed. This is the way you should fix this error if you're having problems when creating your alpha from 3D Geo in ZBrush. It's worth noting this only worked with alphas where the extrusion is either fully above or below the 0 plane. If it goes in both directions, this fix won't work. So let's use this fixed alpha in mask mode. So we ensure the alpha is active and then go to transfer and select make modified alpha. That will create a new alpha with the adjustment baked in. So back to the mask brush and select this new alpha. Make sure that radial fade and mid value are reset back to 0 for the mask rectangle. Now drag as before, invert with Alt, spacebar to position, and mask our area. Select the standard brush and disable the alpha in here. Now drag out, and this time it's perfect. Hooray! So let's switch tools now to the model that we wanted to detail up. So here's the model we want to detail up. We can drag our detail out, position it as we choose with Alt and Mask. Another thing we can do is to add a layer before I create the extraction. Then I have the ability, because I've done this on a layer, I'll turn off record, then I can adjust the slider for this layer to give me precise control. I can even use a negative value. I can dial this in precisely to what I need. Awesome. Okay, so now we have a way to use our alpha with non-uniform scaling. We can make it wide, tall, narrow. We can do what we want with it. We even have arguably better placement abilities too. What we lose though from the brush method is the ability to rotate it. There is a workaround though. We'll rotate the mesh. So we rotate the mesh using Shift and the standard tumble controls. Let's get it roughly straight, just by eye. To get it precise, switch to move mode and disable the gizmo, so we're back in the transposed line. Now draw the transposed line out along the line we want to match, and then Control click the white circle at the end. It looks like I was too accurate by eye. Let's make it a bit worse. Then Control click the white circle and it will rotate the camera so that it's level. Now switch back to draw, then activate masking and draw out the mask. You'll see it lines up perfectly. Let's do another down here. Oh, it's the wrong way up. Never mind, we'll just rotate it. Again, get it roughly right by eye. Switch back to move mode, and you'll see the transpose line is still there from before. So just Control click the white circle, back to draw, mask, drag out and position, and there you go. So let's invert the mask. Now, just as before, let's add a layer before we extract. So I'll clear my mask, turn off record. Now I can adjust the detail as I see fit. Perfect. So that's dealt with how to use non-uniform alphas. If that sorted your problems, you can end here. Stick around though if you're curious about how to deal with a few more edge case scenarios. I mentioned before that this only works if your alpha is only all above or below the zero plane. If you have one that pushes in both directions, what do? Let's go back to our alpha generating mesh. Now I'm going to do some sculpting. Here's a little blob, that will do. As before, I'll use Create Alpha from Mesh. Zoom in again. Click OK. Cool. So now we have middle grey as the background, with black and white signifying pushing in opposite directions. So if I use my brush as alpha, drag that out, and you can see how this is working. We can try adjusting the curve as before. Let's move the points until the background goes black. Now drag that out and you'll see we're only getting half the information. So it just won't work. So how do we fix this? Well, it's not pretty and it's brute force method. This involves scaling the mesh rather than the alpha. It's a bit of a faff, but it's doable. So quickly we'll reset the adjustment curve. Now we need to play with the mid value and dial that in like we did at the start of the tutorial. That's too high. That's too low. Still too high. Not bad, maybe one last tweak. That looks okay. So let's set the radial fade. And that all seems good. So let's use Alt so that we're pushing in. That's strange, it's mirrored it when using Alt. Without Alt it's fine. No problem, we'll simply flip the alpha in the menu. And now we're all sorted. So that's our alpha sorted, but we know it won't work as a mask. But we can't scale, not non-uniformly, with the brush. So what do? We scale the mesh. So let's add a layer, and I'm going to scale my mesh. Brute force. Back to draw mode, we'll rename that layer Scale. Now we add yet another new layer. Now in this layer we're going to drag out our detail. As you see, precise positioning isn't as great this way either. Now we'll name this layer Detail. Okay, turn off Record. All we need to do now is turn off the Scale layer and we have our non-uniform scale detail. So as you see, this takes a bit more planning and some organisation, but it is achievable. If your alpha only pushes in one direction though, I recommend you use the mask method from earlier. So on a very final note, I'm aware this is getting to be a long video. The final point to answer is, why don't we just use Stencil? After all, Stencil was built for this, right? Yes, it was a very long time ago. Let me show you the issue. Let's switch the alpha back to the one we fixed earlier. So brush alpha 1. Okay. Turn off the mid values and things again. Okay, so here's our beautiful fixed alpha. But I want to use this non-uniformly scaled. Now we know how to do this, but let's explore Stencil. After all, it's what Stencil was created for. So I've got the alpha selected. I'll open transfer and select make stencil. And there it is, our stencil. I'm just going to the stencil menu and select elevation mode. Just allows me to see it a little better. So we press spacebar and this brings up the control coin. You can see we can scale it in width only or just height. We can rotate it too. So it's everything we ever dreamed of. So let's get this in the right place. Get the rotation right. There we go, perfect. So let's turn the alpha off in the brush so we can drag out our rectangle. Sometimes invisible masks stop you from affecting the mesh, so just drag out off the mesh to clear this if it happens to you. So dragging out, you can see our stencil has worked. So why didn't we just use this before? Well, hang on a minute. Let's take a close look. Yowza, that's going to take quite a bit of cleanup. Yeah, you can go with smooth and start to clean this up, but if you have lots of detail, this will kill it. As an FYI, if you create an 8-bit alpha, Stencil does work a little bit better. But alphas created from Geo in ZBrush are always 16-bit. So hopefully that's helped you figure out ways to use your alphas in a non-uniform way to detail your meshes. Apologies if it was a little long. If you have any questions or comments, let me know, and happy ZBrushing, guys!